Good afternoon. I'm Dilip Ratha. On behalf of Nomad, welcome to the final seminar of this year before summer, or the first seminar in the World Bank fiscal year, the first Nomad seminar in the new fiscal year of the World Bank. A couple of updates on Nomad. Nomad 1.2, that is the next phase of Nomad, is going to continue, and we have almost sealed a deal with negotiations, and now we are into the contract phase with European Commission for new funding. So we will have a stakeholders meeting to think about the structure of the new Nomad as well as thematic emphasis. That would be sometime in November, and then we would start the Nomad next phase for 5 years. Second important update is that this is the final week of negotiations on the Global Compact on Migration. And the Global Compact on Refugees is also in the final stages, and it's reasonably clear what is going into that, because that was relatively non-controversial. On migration, the Global Compact on Migration, the final document has been now circulated to member states. So we have, I believe Sonia is on the line through VC. She's joined into,
yes,
she's dialing in.
Good
There
morning,
she
Anita.
is. This whole week we were supposed to be there, both Sonia and I, but Sonia went there now, and I'm still here. Tomorrow I'll be going to New York to UN for the negotiations. So they had the first set of negotiations for first 2 days, and then the final document is with the member states. It will come back with the final version on, that is tomorrow, or tomorrow at 11. So there is a Global Compact document, and also happy to report that the Global Compact on Migration actually mentions Nomad. That's a big change, and probably an important
Sonia, can you please mute your
achievement
microphone?
for the World Bank. The third thing I wanted to mention is that we are working closely now with the African countries in particular, but also with the Global Compact, all the member states, to begin to think about implementation of the Global Compact. And in the implementation, a key element has to be a systematic review process for all the objectives and outcomes that member states have agreed on. And for that, you probably know this, instead of high-level dialogues at the UN, the Global Compact on Migration will have what is called the International Migration Review Forums every 4 years. And every second year, there would be regional, international, they're calling it regional migration review forums. So there are these regional forums, and then the global forum every 4 years for review of the Global Compact and progress on Global Compact. We are proposing that for that, we need to have a systematic review process, and it should be somewhat similar to the review process that was started by G20 when G20 was formed after the global financial crisis in 2009. And World Bank and IMF work closely together, particularly IMF takes a central role in looking at submissions by G20 members and their aspirations, their macroeconomic policies, and then looking at coherence of those policies. We are proposing something similar on migration. And a very concrete way of doing that would be, you have the Global Compact and 23 objectives, and below every 3 objectives, every objective, there are 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10 A, B, C, D, E, F, and all that points on what they want to do on that particular objective of the Global Compact on Migration. What we are proposing is to really put all of them, let's say, on an Excel spreadsheet, and then point out a country as a sending country, or a country as a receiving country, what is it doing on that particular sub point of that objective. Let's say objective 1.A, so that is to improve data. What exactly are they doing? Objective 16 point something, let's say, reducing remittance costs. What exactly are they doing? Promoting safe and orderly migration. What exactly are they doing? So, and then have remarks, and hopefully that document becomes available with enough lead time before the review forums so that other member states and international organizations as well as stakeholders can comment on it. So those are three important developments on the global front and on Nomad. I wanted to mention that. I would like to now move on to the main purpose of this BBL, to invite Professor Lucas to make a presentation on a substantive body of work that he has started, which will lead to a book, and it's a massive work on internal migration. So I will let him speak more about that. And I don't need to introduce him. He has been here so many times, and probably many of you have studied under him. So I'll give the floor to you, Bob, and maybe we plan for a half an hour presentation or a little more. Do you want longer than that?
I will go fast.
Yeah.
Thank you, Dilip. Is the microphone on? Yep, good. So my talk today is on migration between the rural and urban sectors of lower income countries. And I just wanted to slip in a little preamble on that. Many of you will know the Harris-Todaro model. It's been central to all of that work for a very long time. In fact, I first became interested in rural-urban migration exactly 50 years ago when John Harris was my teacher. John became my colleague and one of my closest friends at Boston University. John died last week, and I promised his family that I would dedicate this presentation to John's memory. He stayed fascinated by migration right to the very end. I found out that even when he was in hospice, he had actually interviewed all of the staff, immigrant staff, about what their backgrounds were. So he'd remained fascinated to the end. In fact, this is the first time that I've had a chance to present the results that I'm going to go through today, so you may find some glaring holes. If so, I'd love to hear about them as we go along. So, a little background to start with. Most of the evidence on rural-urban migration is not nationally representative. I'm working on this project through Nomad, and I've constructed a data set that is microdata on migration between the rural and urban sectors in about 70 countries. So there's been a pretty massive effort putting together the data. I presented some early results on that at the bank nearly 2 years ago. So I thought I'd start with, by way of background, just a brief summary of some of what went into that early presentation. So on average across countries, if we look at where people originate, those originating from rural areas, about 20% move into towns. 20% of those originating in towns relocate to the countryside. The first person who pointed this out was Alwyn Young, article in 2013. And I think it took a lot of us by surprise that you have this apparent symmetry between the two migration routes. It is true, on average, if you look across countries, and I've cross-checked that, but it does not hold within any one country. I can't find any country where you're even close to having 20% of the people moving from rural to urban and 20% of the population moving in the opposite direction. And you can see a clue to that in these two little diagrams at the bottom. This is plotting the rural-urban migration actually of women in this case against the urbanization rate in countries. So the rural-urban migration rate goes up as the rural sector gets to be smaller and smaller. The urban-rural migration rate goes down as the rural area gets smaller and smaller. You've got a negative correlation across countries in these phenomena. So a second feature I tried to bring out in that earlier presentation, one that fascinates me, is that a lot of the long-term migration, as we call it, people who are moving from 1 year or more, turns out to be not actually long-term, but temporary. There's a lot of movement backwards and forwards between the rural and urban areas in a huge range of these countries. So 3 pieces of evidence on that. On average, 30% of lifetime migrants have moved in the previous 5 years. Now that couldn't be sustained. So there must be some return of those people who have moved in the last 5 years. Second piece, the peak age of moving is about 20 years of age. But the peak age when people moved increases with the age of the person you're looking at. So if you're looking at migrants who are over the age of 50, they moved at a much older age. So I've put up one of the graphs here, the one for Kenya. Quite appropriately, the older people are the ones with the gray curve in there, rather like me. And you can see that they have moved at a much older age than the young people. And the third piece are missing migrants. So I put up a case of Cameroon up here. This is rural to urban migration, looking at 2 different censuses, 18 years apart. So the blue one on the right is the earlier census. These are people who reported they had just moved at that time. They should still be in town if they had remained there. But when we look at the later census, they're not there. So there's been huge turnover of these people. Looking at the people who move from rural to urban areas, there's very strong positive selection on education. The more highly educated you are, the more likely you are to move. That's true virtually everywhere except Iran, which turns out to be a fascinating counterexample to absolutely everything in terms of internal migration. Urban-rural migration is a bit more mixed, but in many countries there is negative selection on education. The more highly educated people in urban areas tend not to move to the rural areas.
No, you have a different slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Should move on. But as that selection of people resort in a sorting process, do we see educated people being accumulated in town and less educated people being accumulated in the rural areas as a result? And the answer is no. The absolute numbers are so overwhelming of low educated people in the rural areas that if we look at their migration into town, they're actually lowering the education profile in town, and the urban rural migrants are actually raising the education profile in the rural areas. So we see selection, but not sorting. And lastly, one thing that had been tended to be ignored in a lot of the literature, when I looked at rural-urban and urban-rural migration patterns, given things like your education, gender, distance, and so forth, there were huge differences across ethno-linguistic groups and religious groups within these countries, something that's been ignored in a great deal of the literature before this. So what are the issues I'm trying to tackle in today's work, and how do I go about doing that? So a couple of major issues in terms of migration between rural and the urban areas. Migration between rural and urban areas is absolutely central to the transformation process in moving from being a predominantly agricultural to a predominantly industrial society. Secondly, the gap in incomes or living standards between rural and urban areas is huge. And in fact, Alwyn Young shows that that gap is probably about the single largest contributor to global inequality. We worry about the top 1%, but it plays a minor role in global inequality compared to this urban-rural gap that we see. The third area, and it's one that will become a focus of what I'm going to talk about today, is there is a huge debate going on in the economics literature. Some analysts see this gap between the rural and urban areas as being an inefficient allocation of labor, something that policy should be redressing, not just on grounds of inequality, but on grounds that this is an inefficient way to see people being allocated. Others portray this as an efficient process, sorting people by skill levels. Industry demands skills, agriculture doesn't, according to this view, and you're finding the less skilled people being sorted into the agricultural sector and vice versa, and that is supposed to be an efficient process of sorting. So, does this matter, or is it just an academic debate? So I'm sorry, this is rather a long quote, but I rather liked it, so I'll read it. Distinguishing whether a given worker employed in the non-agricultural or urban sector is more productive than the same worker employed in the agricultural sector, or whether the income gaps reflect selection on skills, this fundamental debate, is not solely of scholarly interest. The existence of productivity gaps would imply that the movement of population out of rural agricultural jobs and into other sectors could durably raise living standards in low-income countries, narrowing cross-country differences. The existence of large productivity gaps would also raise questions about the nature of the frictions that limit individual movement into more productive employment and the public policies that might affect such moves. So these authors see this as absolutely central, as do I. So given this, I'm going to focus on two main topics today. First, are there significant barriers to moving that prevent efficient relocation of people? The literature on efficient sorting assumes that moves are actually costless, that there are no barriers. And there's some empirical evidence to support those negligible costs. The paper by Hicks and al, it's an NBER working paper, suggests that at least in Indonesia, there are no barriers at all, and in Kenya too. We've seen, I mentioned that from the work 2 years ago, that there is positive selection on education. More educated people move into town. But are we right to assume that this is true on unobserved skills as well? The literature on efficient sorting assumes that education and unobserved skills are positively correlated without looking at any evidence on that, though there is a little bit of supporting evidence for that position. So the empirical approach that I've taken in this involves four main equations to be estimated. First is a reduced form pro-bit of the migration outcome for each individual. Does this person migrate or not, regressed on all kinds of characteristics of the individual. Secondly, an equation estimated on the incomes of migrants at their destination. they're rural-urban migrants, looking at them in the urban sector, vice versa, if they're urban-rural migrants. But using the estimates from one, the probit equation, to recognize that the people you're looking at are a select group, and you can't ignore that selection process. A comparable equation for people who did not move. What are the incomes of people we actually see in the rural areas in this, and those who we see staying in the urban areas? And the last step in this is what I call a structural equation. How do people actually respond to those kinds of income gaps? So that's where I'm heading. So this kind of approach to all of this involves projecting counterfactual incomes for people. What would have been the income of those who stay in the rural areas if they had moved into town? What would have been the income of people who stay in the urban areas if they had in fact moved to the rural areas? There's a long history of using those kind of counterfactual projections in looking at migration, and I put some of the references up there. But I'm picking in particular on some work that I became very fond of. Turkish econometrician Insan Tunali wrote, I thought, an excellent paper in 2000 using these counterfactuals to look at these issues of the returns to migration and selection in migration. And I wind up using his framework in tackling all of this. So I'm sure you won't be able to read this next slide. It's actually in a handout, which I gather is coming around. Yay, great. Well done, Malkia. So in the printed version, you can probably read this a bit better. It looks rather Greek, to say the least of it. So let me try and explain what some of these measures are trying to do. So there are two measures of returns in here. Returns to migration and returns to staying. In essence, what they're doing is asking, what are the real gains to the average population in the rural area if they move into town? And that's taking into account the fact that the group we actually see who moved were a select group. So you're trying to infer something about the people who did not move in this process. Now, when Tunali originally went through this, he was trying to see, are people rational when they make a decision to move? And he said, if the returns are not positive, then people are irrational. To me, that begs the question of what you mean by rational. It would be irrational if the only thing you care about is the income that you get. But there may be lots of other reasons that people move. So I'm not sure I would call it irrational if they don't have positive returns to moving. They may have other objectives in mind. The returns to staying is asking, what would have been the returns to the average rural person of staying in the rural area as opposed to migrating? And again, Tunali says if that turns out to be negative, then they're irrational. They should have moved. But second observer in this, a Brazilian, Avelino, says, well, hold on a minute, you're not taking into account the costs of moving. It may be perfectly clear that they could have gained, but what about the costs of that actual move? Two other elements in that Tunali list are called the sorting gains. The sorting gains to migration and the sorting gains to staying. And those are actually the bits that are attributable to the things you can't observe directly about those people. How important are those? Perhaps more importantly, his last two measures that I'm going to look at about the selection of migrants. Do we in fact see positive selection? Is it the group of people who, given their education, would have had higher incomes in the urban areas who actually tend to leave the rural area and move? And vice versa for those who stay. Is it those who would do better in the rural areas who actually stay, given their income, their education, and so forth? Tunala's interpretation, I think, is the right one in selection. A few other people have used another interpretation, and I wrote it there. It's in your handout. It's a bit technical. I think that alternative interpretation of positive and negative selection really misses the point in terms of selection among the population who are in the rural and urban areas. I think Tunala's measure is the right one in getting at this. So far as I am aware, only two prior estimates of these kinds of parameters exist. One was Tunala's original work, where he looked at place-to-place migration in Turkey, but only among employed male household heads. And he found that the returns are very, very high for a small set of men, but were negative for a very large set of the population, and on average they were negative. He said this is a reflection of the gamble that's involved in moving. And on average, people lose, which is a bit surprising. Avellino calculated the same things for Brazil and found that the returns to staying in the rural areas was negative. He points out that this is quite consistent with having high barriers to moving, and that the costs of moving really are significant. I note at the bottom there, neither of these papers looks at rural to urban migration, and neither undertakes that step 4, looking at what I call the structural version. Do people actually respond to those returns to migration? So the data for this. For this part, I look at microdata on 44 low and middle income countries to derive these parameters. 18 from Africa, well, you can see the numbers up there. 30 are census data, and so on. One major issue, whereas the LSMS data and the other surveys I use all report income, the IPUMS data do not. They have no income data and they have no earnings data in there. So, but what they do report are various aspects of what sort of household appliances do you have, what are the dwelling characteristics, do you actually have a finished floor in your house, do you have electricity, do you have running water? And I've used a technique that has become quite popular under these circumstances of taking principal components on those assets and projecting from that the family living standards. So in some of these countries, that is what I have used. How well do we do? So I tried to line up the cases where I projected those incomes. What do I see in terms of the urban-rural income gap compared to estimates that exist from other sources? And do fit quite well, in fact, in terms of the urban-rural gap. That's fairly close. That's the left-hand graph in here. Do a little less well in projecting the Gini coefficients in these countries. Why? Well, the kind of things that they're asking is, do you have a car? They don't ask, do you have an E-Class Mercedes with a chauffeur to drive it? So you're not getting projections of the super wealthy in these countries. And as a result, you wind up underestimating the Gini coefficients in here. But it's the urban-rural gap that is central to what we're interested in here. So I wind up estimating income equations for migrants and for stayers, separately for men and for women who are born in rural and born in urban areas in 44 countries. So that's actually a total of 328 equations that are all different from each other. 328 because 6 of the LSMS, the urban samples, were too small to do very much with. Plus 164 probits on whether or not people migrate. I did not try to reproduce the table for the income equations. It's 44 pages long. If you want it, I can send it to you. So 2 specific issues that arise in this process of estimation. I'm using the logarithm of family incomes. I'm not using earnings in here. Why? First of all, looking at the family assets and appliances, you're projecting living standards, not earnings. Secondly, if you're going to look at wages or earnings, you've got a very select set of people in most of these countries. Very few wage earners in rural areas in Africa. So you'd have to do again a second level of selection if you're going to do this right. And third, self-employment earnings are extraordinarily difficult to measure well. So I think we actually do better looking at consumption and income as indicators. So one issue that arises, I'm regressing, whether or not you migrate on a bunch of characteristics of the person, your income on a bunch of the characteristics of the person, and a correction from the migration outcome equation to correct for selection. If that selection correction depends on exactly the same things that I'm putting in the income equation, you're in trouble. So you need to come up with some things that are in the migration decision that are not in the income equations. And I wound up using 3 things. One is distance to the nearest city, the marital status of the person, and whether your spouse was born in an urban area. I'm looking at individuals in here, remember. So these are included in the migration outcome, but not in the income equations. And I'll come back and talk about that in a few minutes. So what are the results on the parameter estimates? What do we get out of all this? I will skip over a very technical note on computing the standard errors. It took me nearly 3 weeks to compute those, though I will say. It's quite a nightmare. Returns to migration. The table is in the handout that just came around for you. What are you seeing country by country in here? The returns to rural-urban migration for the rural-urban born are positive and large. You do very nicely, thank you, if you manage to move from the rural to the urban sector. Nearly 90% of the estimates indicate a gain in income greater than 50% as a result. Some of the estimates are much larger than that. Iran is negative. You lose by moving from the rural to the urban areas. Somebody should do a separate study just on Iran. It's a fascinating case. The sorting gains, the bit that depends on unobservables, correction for that, are important in these returns. The average about 30% of the returns that I'm estimating in here. The returns to urban-rural migration for the urban-born are generally negative. People are losing by moving from the urban to the rural sectors, and this is correcting for the selection on who actually makes those moves. This, to me, is strongly suggesting that something else is influencing whether people are deciding to move, quit town and move to the rural areas. The returns to staying for the urban-born are virtually always positive. So if you're born in town, you do very nicely by staying there. For the rural-born, the returns to staying are overwhelmingly negative, suggesting, as Avellino had pointed out, that there are indeed significant costs and barriers to moving from the rural to urban areas. So my results counter some of the other results that people are getting, that there are perfectly efficient allocation of people between these sectors. My results are suggesting that there are real barriers that we need to be thinking about seriously in here. Those costs could be of many different forms. It could be anything from, I need to stay at home to look after my elderly parents, or I don't want to leave my children behind, things of this kind, to literal financial costs of making these moves. There are lots of elements in these barriers, and I'll have some results on what I think seems to matter in a moment. So, selection. What do the selection estimates indicate in here? Are the people who are moving from rural to urban areas positively selected? Are they not only the better educated, but are they the ones amongst the rural-born who would have had higher earnings or incomes in the urban sector? In 2/3 of my estimates, I find exactly the opposite. I'm finding negative selection on these unobservable elements, which again is the opposite to what most of the people in the efficient argument are assuming in their projections. Of the urban to rural migrants, I'm finding 4 out of 5 country cases that the selection is actually positive. These are people who are doing better in the rural areas than would the average-born person do if they moved, given their education and so forth. Selection of stayers, great positive, 90% of the estimates among the rural-born, less than or greater than 0 is mixed amongst the urban-born. So, how sensitive are these results to some of the assumptions we had to make in getting them? So I excluded distance and marital status from the income equations. So I went through a whole battery of sensitivity tests. Do these parameter estimates vary if I put those in? I can't put them both in, but if I put one in or the other one in, do I see significant changes? I only found 2 cases where they significantly changed, and in fact, in the results I gave you there, in both of those, it was for distance, and my estimates that I reported there actually put the distance into the income equations. Estimates of the returns to migration and staying obviously depend on how big is the rural-urban gap. We saw that we've not done too badly in simulating that. So, how much would the rural-urban gap have to be overestimated in my results to turn the returns to staying in the rural area to actually reach 0 as opposed to being negative? Turns out that on average, I'd have to actually halve the urban-rural gap. that we have overestimated that gap by a factor of 2. If we did that, it also turns out that the returns to rural-urban migration would then actually become negative in a third of countries, which is probably pretty unrealistic. And in fact, the method that I use for simulating the incomes in the census data actually tend to underestimate the urban-rural gap rather than overestimating it. So I don't think on these grounds that we're too far out. And this asks, so some of the countries I have direct reports, mostly consumption levels in the LSMS and other surveys, versus the census data where I've tried to project living standards. How big are the differences between these two? Quick look. The left-hand side here looks at rural-urban gaps. The urban-rural parameters. The right-hand side looks at the urban-rural parameters. There are not very big differences in here. So basically, I think we're on reasonably solid grounds in terms of sensitivity. Turn to the structural form. Just because the returns to migration are high doesn't guarantee that people are going to move or that they're able to actually take advantage of this and actually move. What do the data show? So to explore this, I wind up regressing the migration outcome again, but now including the returns to migration in there, plus a few variables trying to represent the cost of migrating. Separate estimates for each country for rural, urban, and urban-rural moves. So what do we see? In 4/5 of the country estimates for the rural-born, the coefficient on predicted income in town is strongly positive, and that on rural income is strongly negative, which, by the way, suggests anything that can raise rural incomes will reduce rural-urban migration, given urban incomes. It is not simply a question of the gap between urban and rural incomes, which is what a lot of people have looked at. Testing whether these are equal and opposite is rejected virtually everywhere. So it does look as if raising rural incomes would be a significant factor in reducing rural-urban migration. Quick note there are very few cases where it looks as if the incentives to move from rural to urban areas is negatively associated with the returns to migration. Guess where? In Iran. This turns out to be true. The discussion earlier suggests if you're moving despite negative returns, this is responding to negative returns. This is suggesting that something else is influencing your migration in here. The relative attraction of being in a rural area or avoiding being in a city. The estimates on the income terms in urban-rural migration, in urban-rural migration, I'm sorry. So the average returns to urban-rural migration are negative almost everywhere. So presumably something else other than just income is relatively attractive at the rural end, at least for these folks. Nonetheless, having to give up less income to attain these other things should be preferred. And in fact, that's exactly what you see even in the urban-rural results. The higher are rural incomes, the higher the likelihood of urban to rural movement. The higher are the urban incomes, the lower is the likelihood of urban-rural migration despite negative returns. I considered 6 potential proxies for the cost of migration. Number 1, a stigma is attached to female migration in a number of societies. In essence, you're imposing a cost on migration of women. Second, the less well-educated are generally from lower socioeconomic status and may have limited access to funds, as well as greater risk associated with urban incomes. So there may be a cost associated with migration for the less well-educated. Third, minor ethno-linguistic groups may face discrimination in the labor market and have smaller networks to offer familiar backgrounds at a new destination. Fourth, similar argument could be made about rural religious minority groups. Fifth, distance from a city is commonly recognized as a deterrent to rural-urban migration. And secondly, something that nobody's really looked at, the census data tend to report whether or not these are disabled people. Is it more difficult for disabled people to move into urban areas? So what do we see? We're nearly there. Inclusion of these proxies, first of all, has negligible effects on the responses to incomes. It's virtually orthogonal, makes no difference at all. In the reduced form, migration equations, including a dummy variable for women, tends to show that women everywhere move more often than men. But once you include the returns that they receive from that migration, the results are far more mixed. There is no clear evidence that women face significant costs to their migration, associated with their migration, though it's very mixed, and I could find no patterns across countries in this. It is not clearly sub-Saharan Africa. It is not clearly the lower income countries within this. But even given income options, those with less education are less likely to move from countryside to town, suggesting significant barriers for them in terms of ability to move. Ethno-linguistic minorities, even given the returns they can hope for in moving, are less likely to move. It is not so true of religious minorities. It is more true of ethno-linguistic groups. Greater distance from cities indeed deters rural-urban migration, even beyond the lower returns of migration for more remote dwellers. But the disabled are generally more likely to move into town. Seems that the difficulties of living in the countryside, the kind of support that you can hope for, is simply less. So, oops, I'm sorry, I should have flipped through, but I think you have some of these in the handout. So last slide, some tentative conclusions. The returns to rural-urban migration are very high. But a word of warning about that. These are returns to individuals. This does not ask what does the individual migration do to the incomes of those who are left behind in here. That I'm hoping to do next. It also doesn't ask any of the macroeconomic implications of this and externality effects of crowding in urban areas, for example. Second, the costs of rural-urban migration are also significant, especially for the less privileged, the less well-educated, members of minority ethno-linguistic groups, and those in remote birthplaces. Selection on education, the returns to rural-urban migration urban-rural migration are more negative, factors other than income play an important part in these decisions. Selection on education is positive in rural-urban migration and negative in urban-rural movements. But selection on unobservables generally runs in the opposite direction to this. Selection on unobservables is negative in rural-urban migration and positive in urban-rural moves. Selection does not necessarily imply sorting. I mentioned this in the background material. So my bottom line, the massive rural-urban gaps do not simply reflect an efficient sorting process of sorting by skills. The barriers to mobility appear very real, leaving some groups isolated from the gains to rural-urban migrations, and I think this needs to be thought about seriously in terms of the kind of policies we're thinking through. So, I'm sorry, I'm sure I'm way over my half hour, but I would certainly welcome any feedback on all of this.
Thanks, Bob. You're almost perfectly on time. I had anticipated you would probably need 10 minutes more, so it's okay. We have a full half an hour to get any answers, or if you have any questions to Bob, and especially how we might relate this sort of work to the sort of work we want to do in the World Bank. So that, in a way, is a comment, but also is a question to you. But people might ask very specific things. So let me open the floor for questions. Let's take 3 questions, and then you can answer, so that would be a little more efficient. Please go ahead. And if you could just say who you are.
If you don't see me, ask me later.
You are next. Okay. You are next. We'll go first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Shohei Nakamura from Poverty GP. I have 2 questions. So the first one is, so when you analyzed urban to rural migration, I saw you focused only on people who were born in urban areas. But I guess that's actually, those people might really different motivation moving from urban to rural, because but if you analyze people who are currently living in urban but they were born in rural, and whether they are actually moving to rural or stay, that's also very important. And this is related to kind of circular migration issue. Maybe data doesn't allow you to do, but that'll be interesting. And also the other question is, so also I guess the literature oftentimes points out the lack of access to basic services in origin areas, I mean rural areas, actually drives rural to urban migration a lot. So did you include that kind of index, so maybe that neighborhood index, or some access to water, electricity, or that kind of stuff, maybe? Yeah.
Thank you. Is it okay if we take 2 more questions? Yeah. Sonia, and then Nadesh.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Bob. I have 3 questions. One question is, when you look at the returns of on the distance variable, have you think to look at if the rural-urban migration, is there difference moving from rural to a city, or from moving to rural to the capital? And how the returns of the migration changes? So I would like to see, because that's why I think that there could be more inequality and there can be more returns. I would like to see if you have thinking about that. That's one. The second one is a little bit in, have you looked at IDPs? The internal displaced when they have moved and they have become more internal migrants. I would like to see if you have looked at those in the things. And in terms of the work of the World Bank, we are talking a lot that there's going to be a huge urbanization, especially in Africa, and you said that in your second phase you will have the externalities, which is on the slums. However, I would like to see if there has been some changes, because if you study Latin America in the 60s and Latin America now, are we going to see that urbanization process, or what you can find from your urban-rural in the Todaro model. And finally, on your ethnic, how do you define the ethnic? Because I know that you took it several ethnics, but I have a counter argument on your case. For example, all the people who speak Quetzal and or the people who are discriminated, like the ones on India that are belong to the low class, the low caste, they prefer not to avoid the barriers at the country. Like, for example, the low caste in India, they will not go within India. They will migrate international. So they overcome that discrimination. And I think that's on the low caste for India. The same for the people from the Guatemala on the border. They don't speak no Spanish, no English. But if you go there in North Carolina, because they overcast that kind of thing. So I would like to see if you have that scenes coming. So looking at the ethnic, if they're going international and not internal, because specifically they will suffer more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Bob, for this interesting presentation. Very, I think, very informative. I have two comments. The first one is related to urban-rural migration, rural-urban migration first. As is said, I think one reason, especially for African countries where we see people migrate from rural to urban, is access to job opportunity. But you find that income might not be the most important one or the major reason, but also access to public infrastructure, because in many urban rural area, they don't have access to water, electricity, or even also have access to public services like healthcare, education. So many families will try to send their youngest or especially boys, less women, especially boys, to rural area to have a better access to education. And like in my origin country in Burkina Faso, you will find that it will be much more male migration to urban area, and women, when they migrate, probably because they are joining their husband or they're trying to look for better job opportunity. And a reason for people not to migrate back to a rural area is like, for instance, in Burkina Faso, you will find that government jobs are sometimes posted in rural area, but people won't look for this kind of job. They will fight to come back to urban area, and this is an issue. So, and because if a husband or a wife decide to go back to a rural area because of the job, it will affect his family or her family. It has a social cost. And for this reason, you will find that some people will fight just to stay in the urban area. But because of the job opportunity, some will take the risk to go back to a rural area, which is not related to the origin community, because you can go back to a rural area which is different from your origin community. So these are my comments.
It's not really a question, but maybe just observation. Thank you, Professor Lucas and Dilipji. This is fascinating. I mean, because I'm also one of the family from the very remote destination of Nepal to the urban, and now here. What I feel now, after 35 years, say 40 years, that while you talk about returns and costs, there are significant non-income type of costs that stayers can gain. They gain like a family network. They gain in that type. But the migrants, they lose family network. Now, this is significant factor. Maybe if you have not considered, maybe you can consider it in your subsequent works. Because what I feel personally is I lost family networks is a big one. But compared to my urban stayers, they have family network intact. That I'm jealous now. Just to share that.
because it links to the.
Please repeat because I couldn't hear you, Kirsten.
No, I haven't started yet because I was confused. It was really my turn or not. So I wanted to link to that. For me, it would be interesting to hear, because you've looked at internal and focusing on rural, urban, rural migration, how that compares to international migration. So which of the parameters you've looked at would be more prevalent in an international context? And so why do people move internally and not internationally? So link it to that discussion and that research, and then also see if because we know, like, usually you have income and education and then gender, but out of the surveys you have, is there any other things we could get to these other non-monetary costs of moving or not moving, like the family networks or the reasons to move, like marriage for women? So if you could differentiate between marriage as a reason for women to move, or if they move on their own because of economic reasons, because it's not, you said that they're more likely to move than men, but their gains are lower, so then I assume it's marriage. But any other things we could have to actually tackle these variables, because we hide so much under the non-monetary costs of moving or non-moving. That would be interesting to see what we can actually get out of the data. But I'm absolutely fascinated for this. I mean, to have this across so many countries is just wonderful.
Thank you. My name is Ririn from the Jakarta Poverty Office. It's just, I think it's lucky that I'm in DC and then I can listen to you on these presentations, because we in Indonesia also just finished one study related to the urbanization. One of the chapters that actually I wrote with colleagues there is about the about the urbanization. But the way how we look at internal migration is not only per se like rural to urban, but in terms of Indonesia, because we use the IFLS data. I don't know which data that you use here in your study for Indonesia, but IFLS data has like panel data since '93, so it's kind of nice be able to look at the way how the migrant, like the long term, the short term, the return migrant. So it's very rich. One of the things that actually we see currently, the internal migration is not only about rural to urban, but also urban to urban. So that's also, I don't know whether you would like to look at and that, because it's also quite interesting. The findings that we see is also interesting. Like, for example, Indonesia, we also be able to try to look at the different kind of the urban. So the cities, you define different type of city. It is big city, it is like small cities, what kind of people that usually move. Distance is actually the one that you mentioned. The finding that you find is consistent with the one that we have. Actually, it's like, it depends on, we call it like they tend to be in the same region, not too far away from home, but I don't know whether you also look at, for example, the reason for migrating, because when we try to look at this, there are different type of reasons for people for migrate. For example, for female here, it seems like the reason probably that the findings that you find is because many that we found in Indonesia, female tend to have a reason for family reason for them to migrate, either following husband, either following parents, so, which is different from like what you mentioned, right? Maybe there's also something related, which is for male, tend to be more economic kind of reason. They want to try to get a job. And also like the trend of a period, it seems like the migrate people also tend to be younger. More educated, yes, and tend to be younger. And one of the fascinating one, migration is apparently a way for them to alleviate a better kind of the socioeconomic status. So comparing to those that are actually non-migrant in the destinations, it seems like they're better off, even though it takes time for them to be in that certain level. So this is also related to not only, monetary type of the, measurements, but we also trying to look at the non-monetary ones, whether they feel safe, whether they, the access to non-monetary, measurement of living. So this is something that actually, I'm happy to share with you, because I think this is something that actually we can exchange, some findings or something. We just finished, like a very preliminary one, but I think it's quite rich information. I think we're lucky that we have such a long panel data set. Thank you.
A lot of questions there to react to. We start at the back and work. I think one of the things I caught there was this issue of timing of the income and what happens to that over time. It's actually something I'm trying to work on exactly at the moment. I'm using the Indonesia Family Life Survey and about 6 or 7 other panels, trying to look at what we actually see in that. So come back and I'll tell you what I've got on that. It is tricky. There's, I don't know if you know the work of George Borjas on this, on international migration in the US, that if you look at how long people have been in the US and immigrants, it looks as if the immigrants actually pass the native-born people in the US. But he pointed out that it's actually a vintage effect, that it's the earlier arrivals were a very different set of people than those who have arrived recently. And if you do the same profiles for both, they are catching up with the locals, but not overtaking them. So vintage versus age versus how long you've been here is quite difficult to disentangle in all of this. Rural, urban, absolutely, it is important. I decided to focus on rural-urban in this and cut it short, but the importance of that very clearly depends on the level of urbanization in the country. Rural is extremely important in where urbanization is low. In South America, urban migration dominates completely. Marriage as a cause is difficult to disentangle. I'm not a great believer in the question that asks people, why did you move? I've moved several times, and I honestly don't think I could tell people why I moved. One of the great difficulties in working with these data sets is that none of them asks, when did you marry? Would have been a key question, but none of them ask it. But as I thought about it, in large parts of the world, marriage isn't necessarily that formal. People move in with each other without going through a formal marriage, so asking did you marry isn't the right question. In fact, I think I said at the last presentation on this, I was rather shocked going through the data. It turns out that there are way more married women in the world than there are married men. No, even if I control for the polygamy in these countries, it's nothing to do with that. I think it's purely a question of commitment. The men don't admit that they're married and the women do. And the numbers are enormous. The biggest gap in Africa is Sierra Leone. It's enormous. It's something like 2 to 1. Yes.
That's remarkable.
Yeah. Anyway, international versus internal. An important question. There is only one of the data sets, though do correct me on this, that I know of we can actually look at, and that's the Mexico Family Life Survey. None of the LSMS ask which of your family members are abroad, how many of your family members have gone abroad. The census data ask, has any of your family members gone abroad? But it's a vague question. When? Over how long an interval are we talking about? So very difficult to work on. In most countries, the numbers of people going abroad are pretty tiny compared to the number of internal migrants. So I don't think it's a dominant issue. Network at home, absolutely matters. Nice paper by Mark Rosenzweig, and I'm forgetting the other author's name, he used to be a colleague of mine in the department, looking at India. showing that networks in your home village are really important, particularly credit markets, and your access to credit within the village through a network is critical to whether or not you can move. Non-married women, the next chapter I'm going to write about is on that, but I have started looking at the data and I was surprised. The movement of never married women is a lot higher than I thought. But there is an issue, are they just moving with their parents? But in fact, even in Africa, I'm finding a surprising number of never married women who are not living with any family members in town. Though they tend to be a lot older on average. It's not the young never married women, they're older women who are in that position. Facilities, yes, matters, but we don't have very good data on that. You need facilities at origin, and ideally you'd like to compare that with the facilities at destination. The LSMS tend to collect data on facilities in the rural areas, but we have nothing at the urban area to compare with in there. So I tried in a couple of cases, it turned out to be statistically insignificant. Do I believe that? I think this issue of moving for the education of the children is an important one. One thing we see in the Demographic and Health Survey data don't ask where you were born, they ask where did you grow up. The urban migration from where you grew up is much higher than the rural migration from where you were born. And I think the difference is these are actually rural-born people who migrated into town, grew up and particularly went to school there, then returned to the rural areas. Do you want to call them rural-urban, or are they urban-rural migrants? I'm not sure that it is true that the low ethnic populations tend to go abroad more often, as opposed to internal. I'd be curious what evidence we have on that, Sonia. Since I can't see the emigration of these people, I can't really explore that, but I'd be curious what our evidence is on that. Is the world heading for where Latin America is in terms of urbanization? It's a long way to go. Difficult to project. I think it's going to be quite a while in Africa before we get there, and in South Asia. China seems to be moving there a lot faster, certainly. IDPs, clearly important in a lot of places, but I don't have data. I don't know whether the individual people I am looking at are an internally displaced person or not. I don't have data on Syria. I don't have data on the DRC. I do have Colombia, but even in Colombia, they don't tell me whether the person is an IDP or not. Lifetime migration versus what I would think of as return migration. I think that's really important. I'm trying to look at it, but it's quite difficult. The one thing I'm trying to do at the moment is with the panel data is to see of people who are born in a rural area but then show up in town at some point, who then show up again later in a rural area. Are they the ones who are doing poorly in town? Are they the ones who are doing relatively well in town? Is it target saving? Could be the ones who have come in, done very well, and have retired back to the rural areas. So at the moment, I'm trying to tease that out, but I think the amount of evidence we can have is fairly thin on it. But I agree, an interesting and important issue. How does it all tie back to policies? I think both at the macro and the micro level. And I think a lot of people miss the macro picture in here. The macro level, the exchange rate, trade policies, subsidies, agricultural subsidies, All of this stuff matters in influencing the balance between the rural and the urban areas. And we don't hear very much talk about that. Everybody seems to focus on the micro issues, and some of those are certainly important. One that I want to throw into the arena that doesn't seem to get mentioned enough for my money is the quality of rural education. We have good measures of the amount of education, but very little on the quality of that education, particularly for minority ethnic groups in distant places. What does that really look like? Interesting stuff in Kagera study in Tanzania on rural roads, showing that rural roads indeed can enhance the ability of people to move into town, but also to return. An interesting piece, we were just talking about it over lunch, an unpublished paper on cell phones. They did an experiment in Niger. They gave cell phones to some villages, not to others. The villages that they gave cell phones to, seasonal migration into the town increased dramatically. So information seems to matter in there. So I think a lot of areas where interventions in various ways can affect this and can reach those excluded communities.
Any last minute questions? Anything else to say, Ririn?
I'd love to see your report, please.
So, go ahead.
Say that it would be nice at the end, because you started your presentation asking what this all means for development, and if we should actually want to see more internal migration than less if we are interested in development. So it would be nice if your presentation kind of finished with conclusions along those lines as well. I don't know if you want to say a few words on that.
Yeah, I think I differentiate between growth and poverty in there. I think any economy that's going to grow rapidly is going to be industrializing. The agricultural sector rarely grows quickly. And if you're going to move from predominantly agricultural to predominantly industrial, you're going to see very substantial migration. So I think it plays a key part in that process. Now, whether the growth causes the migration or the migration enables the growth, very difficult to disentangle. But they're certainly, I think, pretty inextricably tied up. In terms of poverty, does rural-urban migration wind up alleviating poverty? Of the people who move, yes. What's less clear is what it does to the people who don't manage to move. We've seen that there seem to be very significant barriers to some of these people being able to access the rural areas. And one of the kind of areas of literature that I like a great deal, it's called cumulative inertia. That you live in a remote village, nobody manages to go to town, so you never set up a network. So over time, nobody goes. As opposed to a village that's near the city, somebody gambles and moves in, and it works out, others follow. So you get cumulative pockets of poverty left as a result of this, isolated from migration. So whether it's going to reach those kind of people, what it does to people left behind, and I gather in China at the moment this is a big issue. Massive rural-urban migration of the young, apparently, but we don't have any reliable data on it. But complaints about what that's doing to the elderly who are left behind in the rural areas. So I'm less sure on the poverty front.
Thank you both. It's fascinating presentation, and the results and the rich data set is quite amazing. So I'm hoping that we will continue to have you more often next year to hear as you make progress on different aspects of it, and in particular on that married, unmarried issue of men versus women 2-to-1 ratio.
Yeah.
That would be fascinating as well. Well, thanks a lot again.
Okay.
And we'll be.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Very nice.
Bye, Sonia.
Bye.